All right, buckle up, everybody, because today we're going deep, deep into Nazi Germany, but not the typical stuff, like Nazis are bad, which
Yeah.
we know. We're going way past that. We're going to figure out how they actually took control and what kinds of pushback they got.
Yeah.
Opposition. Like, what kind of opposition did they face?
Yeah, it's really something, It's both fascinating and scary. I mean, we always think about the horrible things that the Nazis did, but it's really important to understand how they got that control, like what were the actual systems of control. If we can understand that helps us to grasp, I think, like the whole impact.
It's like looking under the hood of this terrifying machine, right?
Yeah.
And the thing is, we've got some really amazing sources, and these sources go way beyond your typical textbook history.
Yes.
So we're gonna break it all down together. What really gets me is that there were cracks. There were cracks in the Nazi regime, like little pockets of resistance. Places you wouldn't expect. I mean, where do we even start with all of this?
Well, you can't really understand the opposition without understanding the system itself, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the Nazis, just like any totalitarian regime, the basis of their control was ideology.
Okay, so let's talk about that ideology. What were those core beliefs that they used to justify everything they did?
Well, they had a few core pillars, that they really pushed hard. The first one was this need for a single all-powerful leader. That was the whole Führer principle, right? And then there was this myth of the master race. And this one is really what fueled all that persecution, the persecution of anyone they thought was inferior, less than. And then of course there's Lebensraum, this idea that they needed to get more land,
Yeah.
They needed to expand to create this living space for the German people.
Hold on. Let's stop on that Lebensraum for a minute. I mean, it sounds kind of abstract,
Yeah.
like some sort of theoretical thing. But how did it actually play out? What were the real world consequences of this idea?
Okay, so think of it this way. If you believe that your people are meant to rule, and you need more land, more space for this growing empire, well, then what happens? It leads to aggression, It becomes a justification for invading other countries and displacing or even eliminating entire populations.
Wow, that's really chilling when you put it that way. And then you've got this master race concept. Some of our sources actually use the term subhuman to describe how the Nazis viewed certain groups. I mean, it's just horrifying.
Yeah, absolutely. And this wasn't just, hateful words. This was like the ideological backbone for the systematic persecution of Jews, Slavs, Roma, and others. I mean, this idea of a master race, it just permeated everything.
Okay, so they've got this deeply disturbing ideology, but how did they actually enforce it? I mean, how do you control a whole nation?
Well, that's where the fear comes in. The Nazis, they were masters of using terror to silence anyone who disagreed with them. And that's where the Gestapo comes in. A secret police force with a truly chilling reputation for brutality.
Right, the Gestapo. I mean, we all know the name, but I think we need to dig a little deeper here. What made them so effective? Was it just brute force?
It was much more than that. It was more like insidious, Imagine living in this constant state of suspicion, never knowing who to trust. The Gestapo, they relied on this massive network of informants. They actually encouraged citizens to report on each other.
Wow.
I mean, it could be your neighbor, your coworker, even your own family.
Reining you in.
Exactly. And that created this atmosphere of self-censorship. People were just terrified to say anything, even in private,
So you couldn't even think freely.
Not without the fear of being reported.
And what about those who did speak out? What happened to them?
Well, that's where the people's courts came in.
People's courts. I mean, that sounds almost democratic, which seems completely at odds with everything else we're talking about.
Right.
What were they really like?
Yeah. Don't be fooled by the name. They were anything but just. They were set up to punish anyone seen as an enemy of the state, often with made up charges, and the verdict was already decided.
So basically, you're hauled before this judge. And they've already decided you're guilty, no chance of a fair trial, no lawyer, no defense.
Right.
That's terrifying. And of course, we can't forget about the concentration camps.
Oh, absolutely. The camps, they were this constant, this brutal reminder of what would happen to you if you defied the Nazi. I mean, they became these symbols of Nazi terror, and they really instilled fear. They silenced opposition all over the country. But the Nazis, they didn't just use, these broad terror tactics. They also targeted specific groups with chilling precision.
I mean, it's almost impossible to really get, the scale of the suffering that was inflicted, especially on the Jewish people. I was reading in one of our sources about, how they systematically dehumanize Jews. And it started with the Nuremberg laws. Can you talk a little bit about those laws? Like what did they actually, what did they do and what kind of impact did they have?
Well, the Nuremberg laws, they were essentially like the legal framework for stripping Jews of their citizenship, of their basic rights.
Yeah.
It's like imagine one day you're a citizen, right? You've got rights, you've got protections, and then the next day you're legally defined as a second-class person. You're subject to all this discrimination, it's a really stark reminder of how quickly a society can shift,
Right.
from tolerance to exclusion and hatred, and all under the guise of law.
It's mind-boggling. And it wasn't just about legal status, right?
Yeah.
Our sources describe how Jews were targeted economically. The boycotts of Jewish businesses, the outright seizure of their property. It's like they were being systematically erased from society.
Absolutely, yeah. The Nazis, they used economic warfare as a tool of persecution.
Yeah.
They stripped Jews of their livelihoods and they pushed them further into isolation and poverty. And it wasn't just about hatred, it was also about greed. It was about seizing wealth and assets.
And then there's Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. I mean, it's a truly chilling example of state-sanctioned violence.
Yeah, Kristallnacht was a real turning point. It was a night of just organized terror. Synagogues and Jewish businesses destroyed. Homes ransacked. Countless people beaten, arrested. This wasn't just, random violence. This was orchestrated. It was encouraged by the Nazi leadership.
One detail that really stuck with me from our sources was this thing about stamping Jewish passports with a J. I mean, it seems like such a small thing,
Right.
but it's so symbolic.
Yeah. It's a very powerful example of how the Nazis, they were so meticulous in their efforts to identify and isolate Jews, to mark them as different. It's a chilling reminder of how even these seemingly bureaucratic things can be used to enforce discrimination and oppression.
And we have to remember that this brutality wasn't limited to Jews. I mean, the Nazis targeted other groups who didn't fit into their twisted vision of a master race.
That's right. Disabled people, homosexual men, Roma, Jehovah's Witnesses. I mean, anyone deemed undesirable or a threat to the regime's so-called purity. They were subject to persecution, imprisonment, even extermination. The scope of their cruelty was just vast and horrifying.
It's almost overwhelming to think about, and it raises a really big question. I mean, with all of this terror, all of this oppression, why? Why wasn't there more resistance? How could people just stand by and let this happen?
Yeah, it's a question that historians and survivors have grappled with for decades. There's no easy answer. You have to remember that the Nazis, they had systematically dismantled any kind of organized opposition. Political parties were banned, unions were crushed, free speech was non-existent.
So even if you wanted to resist, there was no structure, no organization. You'd be completely on your own, facing the full force of the Nazi state.
Exactly.
And let's not forget the propaganda.
Oh yeah.
I mean, the Nazis were masters at manipulating public opinion.
Oh, they were incredibly good at it.
They used radio, film, newspapers to spread their message, to demonize their enemies.
Absolutely.
So it wasn't just fear. Some people actually believed what the Nazis were saying.
Yeah. That's a really crucial point. For a lot of Germans, the Nazis, they offered this sense of order, of purpose. After the chaos and the instability of the Weimar Republic, they promised economic recovery, national pride, a return to greatness. And this appealed to a lot of people who were desperate for change, for stability.
It's a reminder that propaganda, it doesn't always have to rely on outright lies.
Right.
It can twist the truth. It can play on people's fears, their anxieties. and it can offer these simple solutions to really complex problems.
Exactly. And the Nazis, they were masters at exploiting those vulnerabilities.
But even with all the fear, all the propaganda, there were still cracks in the facade, right?
Right.
There were people who resisted,
Yeah.
even when the odds were stacked against them. And that's what I find so fascinating. Even in these darkest of times, there were these sparks of defiance, these glimmers of hope. And our sources highlight some really, really interesting examples of opposition, of resistance, like the Edelweiss Pirates and the Swing Kids. These weren't your typical resistance groups.
No, they weren't.
Can you tell us more about them?
Yeah, these groups are really fascinating because they represent this kind of cultural resistance. The Edelweiss Pirates, for example, they were working class youth who rejected the strict conformity and the militarism of the Hitler Youth. So they formed their own groups, they went hiking, camping, they listened to banned music, they even clashed with Hitler Youth patrols.
So it was almost like a counterculture movement. Like they were rejecting the dominant ideology.
Exactly.
Through their lifestyle, their activities.
Yeah, they weren't necessarily engaged in organized political resistance, but they were carving out their own space.
Yeah.
For freedom, for self-expression in a society that was becoming increasingly controlled.
And then you have the Swing Kids, who rebelled through their love of jazz and swing music.
Right.
Which the Nazis considered degenerate.
Right. The Swing Kids, they're really interesting. They embraced this music, this dance that the Nazis saw as a threat. They held their own dances, often in secret, and they embraced this kind of rebellious individualism that the Nazis just hated.
It's amazing to see how even something like music could become a form of resistance.
Absolutely. For these young people, it was about more than just music. It was about creating their own identity, about expressing their individuality, rejecting the stifling conformity of Nazi culture. But resistance wasn't limited to youth groups. Even within the church, there were those who dared to speak out.
It seems like the church, at least in some cases, became this unexpected source of opposition.
Yeah.
So how did they actually push back against the Nazis?
Well, it wasn't, it wasn't widespread, but there were definitely individuals and groups within the church who spoke out against Nazi policies.
Yeah.
Especially those targeting Jews and other minorities. And one of the most striking examples of this is the papal encyclical Mit brennender Sorge, or with burning concern in English.
Okay, yeah, I've heard of that, but I got to be honest, I don't really know much about it. What was so significant about it?
Well, this encyclical, it was written by Pope Pius XI, and it was basically a direct condemnation of Nazi ideology and its attacks on the church and human rights. I mean, imagine this. It's 1937. Nazi power is at its peak. And in every Catholic church across Germany, this letter is read aloud, denouncing Hitler's regime. It was a really bold act of defiance. It was a clear message that even the Pope wouldn't stay silent.
Wow, that must have taken incredible courage,
Well,
especially considering the potential consequences. Our sources also mentioned some individuals within the church who actively resisted the Nazis.
Yeah, figures like Martin Niemöller and Dietrich Bonhoeffer, they're really notable. Niemöller, he was a Lutheran pastor, and he actually initially supported Hitler, but he became disillusioned, as he witnessed the regime's growing brutality, and he eventually became a very vocal critic.
Yeah.
And that landed him in a concentration camp.
And Bonhoeffer, he was involved at a plot to assassinate Hitler, right?
That's right. He was theologian, a pastor who believed that Christians had a moral obligation to resist Nazi tyranny, even if it meant taking up arms. So he was involved in the resistance movement, and ultimately he paid the ultimate price. He was executed by the Nazis just weeks before the war ended.
It's really inspiring to see these examples of people who refused to compromise their principles, even when their lives were at risk. So we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the the chilling efficiency of Nazi control, the systematic persecution of entire groups of people, but also these surprising flickers of resistance. I mean, what stands out to you the most from all of this?
What really strikes me is the complexity of human behavior, even under these really extreme circumstances. I mean, on the one hand, you have this incredibly organized system of control, of oppression, designed to crush any hint of dissent. But then on the other hand, you have these individuals, these groups, who find the courage to resist, to push back against this tide of hatred and tyranny.
It's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit can endure.
Exactly. And it also underscores the importance of understanding how these systems of control, how they work, how they gain a foothold, how they manipulate people, how they exploit people's fears, their prejudices, because ultimately the best way to prevent these kinds of atrocities from happening again is to be aware of the warning signs and to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult.
Yeah, I think you've really hit the nail on the head there. This deep dive has been both enlightening and sobering. It's a reminder that history, it isn't just, something we read about in textbooks.
Right.
It's full of lessons that we can apply to our own lives and to the world around us.
Absolutely. By understanding the past, we can better equip ourselves to face the challenges of the present and to build a future where these kinds of horrors are never repeated.
Well said. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us, and for you listening, we hope this has given you something to think about and maybe even a little bit of hope. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.